said before in one of the prayers, it wasn't that long ago that we were celebrating this beautiful gift of the Christ child. We're deciding how to respond, and then what happens? Life happens. We get back with our lives, and this week we're in transition. Now, I had planned out, what I usually do when I plan out a sermon is like today, for example, I'll be praying about next week's message. So I'll spend prayers today and tomorrow, and then I'll have this thought that comes into my head. And then I'll start doing some research. And so Tuesday and Wednesday, I'll be researching and praying about what does God want me to talk about. And then I'll start writing it on Thursday. And Thursday, I'll put the notes together. Friday, I write. Saturday, I write. Sunday morning, I'm writing. So I had it planned out where I know the gist of what I'm talking about, because we're in this long sermon series. We just finished Necessary Sins. And now we're getting ready to go into how it looks when we are Christians who actually follow Christ. And there was this little 1 week spot I had that I needed to fill. And I was praying about what do I do, and so we're going to talk about that today, but then that turned into a 2 or 3 or 4 week service. So I always laugh at it that somebody says, well, tell God you're done, and tell God you got a plan. And I laugh at it because it doesn't quite work that way. But this transition period, so we finished talking about some of the things that we've been getting back to in life after Christmas, those necessary sins. And they're not really necessary, but we can't just seem to leave them behind to follow Christ. They're not really necessary. And they're symptoms of a bigger problem. Our sinful ways of going against God and His ways, that's just a part of the symptoms. You see, all sin is addicting, and all sin is besetting. Some addictive sin is not as prominent as other addictive sin, but all sin is besetting and addictive. The only problem is we don't mind it sometimes when that sin gets us what we want. Well, what about wanting to follow Christ? See, there are a lot of different ideas and opinions on what it means to be a Jesus follower. And we had a clergy meeting here 3 weeks ago, and there were probably 16 of us here, local clergy, and I can guarantee you we had 16 different interpretations of Scripture. And there are different, like I said, there are a lot of different ideas about what it means to be a Jesus follower, so we're going to get right to the source. We've been looking at different things Jesus has taught us and said to figure out what the life of someone who follows Jesus should look like. And I guess also, those necessary sins, what it shouldn't look like. Sometimes it's easier to relate to what it shouldn't look like. So today, I want to talk about a phrase that I learned when I was right out of college. And it's something we've all heard before. It's something that drives and steers our very lives without us even thinking about it. It's just natural. It's like loving coffee. It just comes to you when you're born. And that is the phrase, what's in it for me? Because we get into things based on what we get out of things. And it's the basis of what we decide to do or not do. And I'm convinced that this Christian subculture, many followers of Jesus, they're caught up in it as a form of Christianity, but guess what? It's not the real deal. Why is it not the real deal? Because it's basically self-directed. It has an unstated but very apparent goal after conversion to feed ourselves, protect our families, live in a bubble and get to heaven. Maybe we can self-righteously criticize somebody who's not as holy as us in the process. That's a bonus. But one of the most basic and hardest to live out tenets of being a Christ follower isn't to feed ourselves. It's to die to ourselves. That's what our baptism symbolizes. That's at the heart of Jesus' teaching. Die to yourself. Live for others. But consumer Christianity teaches the opposite. To live to myself, live for myself, and somehow, somewhere, a lot of us still drink that Kool-Aid. It's not something you're taught either. At some point, it's just something you gravitate toward. It's just a question you start asking yourself to gauge your involvement with something. This is something we have to talk about because it's a powerful motivator. As a matter of fact, that's why this sermon today is titled Christian Crack. I had somebody made a comment when I posted on my Facebook page, join us, 9:30. We're going to talk about Christian crack. And I get this message, that's not very funny. I had an addiction, and I replied back in a personal message, guess what? We all have an addiction. There is something that we are addicted to so much that it is like crack to Christians. And I got that title from somebody who I was playing a game of Scrabble with, and they got some really good... Who here plays Scrabble? I love Scrabble. I'm addicted to it. And I'm pretty good at it, I think. There's my pride, sorry. But, so I'm playing a game with this friend of mine, and they got this great set of tiles to start off with. And you know how it is when you're playing somebody, and the first play they do is to use all 7 of their tiles? And they're scoring like 507 points in that one. No, not really that much. But she scored like 30, 40 points. And she goes, I'm sorry, we really should start over. You know, I was blessed with some really good tiles. And I said, no, but if you embarrass me that bad when we play, then you're going to owe me a cup of coffee. And she goes, coffee. Crack for Christians. And I sat there and I'm like, there's a sermon in there. I turned out and I won, by the way. So you never want to be too prideful in what you're doing. It's Christian crack, consumer Christianity. It's not something you're taught. It's a powerful motivator. And if we're not careful, we start to move toward a consumer lifestyle. We can become people who see and navigate through the world based on how it is able to serve us. People become tools to help us achieve something or obstacles that keeps us from something. And this is something Jesus quickly shifts his disciples' focus out of. And I believe that most, if not all, of Jesus' disciples first began following Jesus because of what they thought they could get out of it. But you don't have to run through too many pages of the New Testament before you see that Jesus begins moving them out of that consumer mindset. And I had to ask myself a question. Ask yourself this question. What does God want? And people come up to me and they go, what does God want? Well, here it is. God wants us, every single one of us, to respond to the gift like the wise men, to seek him out, to think like Christ, to act like Christ, to become more like Christ. We have an opportunity right now. We could be the ones, we could be those generations that put an end to the mindset of Christian crack, of consumer Christianity, as we are the church. And so many times, and this cracks me up all the time, that so many people come to a service or any type of gathering, and we often critique. And you know the ones. We gossip. I don't know why I looked at you all when I said gossip. Charlie's up. That's it. We slander. We get angry. We complain. We walk away. And I'm hearing the comments when people walk away. Yeah, the sermon was okay. Songs were, sorry, Pat, they're saying songs are okay. I didn't like that one song. They didn't play a song I wanted. The music was too loud. The kids wouldn't be quiet in the pews. Do you see what Becky wore? And did you see who came in after what they did this week? My gosh. Like, when did all of this start? Like when people would walk out of a room or away from a gathering and say, I didn't like worship today. And they think that's an okay thing to say. Like, can we just kill that? Can we just be the generations? Can we just be right here, right now, the people that go, you know what? Who messed this up? When did we start going, hey, what would you guys want? What would you like? And, well, if you didn't like it, we'll fix it before next week. Can we get back to, you know what? I came here to pour out everything to Jesus, for passionate worship, for risk-taking missions, and for generosity. So I'm imagining the angels up in heaven. You know what they're doing, right? Every minute of every day, they've got their eyes fixed on God, and they're looking up at God, and they're singing songs, and they're praising Him, and I can't picture them going, worship wasn't that good today, big guy. I don't care for the music. It's too loud. Seats were uncomfortable. I know. That's what he's saying. So what happens when you don't see the benefit? And I have seen people completely walk away from the church and have nothing to do with it, simply because it didn't spark their joy. It didn't serve them. They didn't see a benefit in following Christ. And we completely miss the primary reason we're here. You and I are created to have an impact and influence on the world around us. We are created to be a catalyst for the change the world desperately needs. All you've got to do is look out in the world around us, and you see how broken and hurting and struggling there are. And if you're on Facebook, you got it twice as bad because you see it. Who here has ever been to that? First of all, who has Facebook? Mom, I've seen your post. I don't know if I'd want to claim that. Who here has ever been to that that Facebook page, Cumberland on Patrol? Isn't that nice to know? It gives you that idea that my life is not as screwed up as somebody else's. But you see exactly. You see the arrest, you see the car accidents, you see everything going on around you that you normally wouldn't have seen. You and I were created to have an impact and an influence on the world around us and our communities. We're created to be a catalyst of change that the world desperately needs. And we will only create positive change in the world around us with a contributor mindset. Not as a member, but as a disciple. And Jesus quickly shifts the focus of his followers from personal gain at the expense of others to personal sacrifice for the benefit of others. He was constantly pointing his followers to focus on the needs of other people. And when I think about the idea of serving, there are two things that pop in my head. One of them is, and I'm not going to embarrass you, Mom, but I'm going to embarrass you. Because this is, y'all don't always get up in time for the 9:30 service, so bless your hearts. But I remember when I was a little tiny kid, and I had this toy horse, and it was on wheels. And this is back when the neighborhoods were safe, and I don't know what town we were in, what military base we were living at. But Mom would be inside, and I'd be outside, and she wouldn't mind because she could hear me with those wheels on the pavement. Well, then at one point, I got too big for the toy. I had my fun out of it. So I remember Mom marching me down to the donation box, and I had to give that toy away. I love that toy, but I gave it away because I had enough joy out of it, and I knew I wasn't here to be served. I was here to serve. I didn't know really what that meant, but then there's another story, even better illustration, because there are some hurdles that we have to get by in order to do this thing called Christianity effectively. And I can't think of a better illustration than the one that Jesus told. And if you've been around a church very often, you heard Jesus' story about the Good Samaritan. And you probably know how the story ends, but we'll go over that if you're not familiar with the story. But I want to focus on especially how the story starts. And it started with this expert of the law, a scribe, someone who was well versed in the Old Testament, law, and would even aid in creating new laws and to make navigating the old laws a little easier. And that this guy came to test Jesus. And he asked him, how do I inherit eternal life? And Jesus' response was what's written in the law. So how do you read it? I think the scribe's tone changed right here. I've heard it preached before that he was proving his arrogance, and that's possible. You know, we all know people who are in church and they think that they know more than everybody else knows, and they're trying to prove somebody's ignorance. And that's possible. But a part of me wonders if he was wanting Jesus to justify the rules that he's already put in place that would keep him from doing what he already knew he should have been doing. Then Jesus speaks directly to this and points out the same hurdles to this guy that we have to cross ourselves. And it makes me wonder if we've convinced ourselves who we should and who we should not serve based on our own reasoning and our own rationale. So Jesus launches into his story and points out the challenges we face as well as what the expert of the law faced. So if you have your Bible with you, we're going to turn to Luke 10, 30 to 32. Luke 10, 30 to 32. Luke 10, 30 to 32. It's somewhere in there between Genesis and Revelation. Somewhere after Proverbs and the Psalms. So Luke 10, 30 to 32. And that's where Jesus replied with a story. He says a Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, they beat him up, and they left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along. But when he saw the man lying there, he crosses over to the other side of the road, and he passes him by. And a temple assistant walked over it and looked at him lying there. And then he passed by on the other side. And we're going to pause there because I always think that's the start of a really good joke there. Well, this priest and this temple assistant walked by. But they had good reasons not to stop. I know for a fact they did. The priest and this scribe, this Levite, are often painted as the bad guys in the story. But they're not the bad guys. They probably had legitimate reasons for not stopping. There were the laws of the unclean. They were heading into work, fears of safety in case those bandits came back. They had to get their kids to a ball game. How many times did we hear that one? It was a matter of priority for them. Their focus was on them. And it caused them to miss or walk past a need that was in their path. They walked right by this guy. And this is the difference in walking through the world as a consumer, and this guy is an interruption or an inconvenience, or walking through life as a contributor, and this guy is an opportunity. Isn't it so easy to be just like these two men and choose ourselves? So let's see what happens in 10:33. I love this story. Then a despised Samaritan came along. And when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. So there's one difference that Jesus pointed out as to why this guy stopped. It's the word compassion. When the crowd first heard, but a Samaritan, I think there was a bit of confusion because it sounded like a plot twist to a good movie that wouldn't have made any sense whatsoever. And it wasn't just Jews in the crowd. There were Samaritans as well, and I don't think they gasped either. I think everyone assumed that the Samaritan would just walk by. He had every reason to walk by. There were hundreds of years of hatred between these two groups. It was a hatred based off of race, religion, ideology, politics, and year after year that the hatred grew because they were given more and more reason to hate each other. Because it wouldn't have been historical hate. Now it's based off personal experience. But this guy had compassion. And it's that deep hurt for what someone is battling so much so that it moves you into action. The Samaritan did what sometimes seems like the impossible. See, he didn't care about being served. He served. He didn't care about being served. He served. See, he knows what it's like to be hated. He knows what it's like to be ignored. He's been the outcast and the person people avoided. He knows what it's like to not be cared for. And his empathy moved him closer to this guy when it would have been so easy to let their differences keep them apart. And in 2,000 years, the world hasn't changed much, has it? The state of our world is so divided right now, divided politically, divided racially. Whether we're going to wear a mask or not wear a mask when somebody coughs. Economic, socially. Ironic, isn't it, how it hasn't changed any? And what you see is escalating arguments over who's right, who's wrong. Reminds me so much, who's more important. What you're seeing is somebody who is a consumer Christian. Somebody who's hooked on Christian crack. And reminds me so much of, the Bible study we're in is about 1 Corinthians, and it's the same thing that was going on in the church back then. So let's look at Luke 10, 34 and 37 now. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. And the next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, "Take care of this man. And if this bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here." Now, which of these would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits, Jesus asked. The man replies, "The one who showed him mercy." Then Jesus said, "Yeah, go now, do the same thing. Go now and do the same thing." See, but this isn't an easy trip. This is a 17-mile hike. This is over 3,500 feet straight up and straight down. It's rough terrain. You know what would have made this trip easier? Bandages, olive oil, a donkey or two. Probably a little bit of wine would have helped out. But he wasn't just going to give this guy some good advice on how to make his trip a little bit easier. He wasn't just going to tell him how to avoid the robbers next time. The follow-through was just so incredible. Our responsibility as Christians is not just meeting spiritual needs. We have to be willing to meet physical needs before we can speak to their spiritual needs. And if it was only easy to know what to do. But you see, the only way we know what to do is to first ask the question, how can I serve? How can I serve? Leading the conversation with how can I serve, that's a game changer. Not how am I going to be served? How am I going to be fed? What about me? No, going, how can I serve? It sets the tone of how do I learn who I am to where you are. The follow-through, as I said, with this guy was just incredible. He stayed with him through the night, gave the innkeeper 2 days' wages, and said, keep an eye on him. Then he came back. I would have loved to have heard the conversation that would have taken place on his return when he walks into the room. He's asked, what are you doing here? I'm coming back to check on you. Wait. Whoa, wait a minute. You're that guy? You're the guy who did all of this? You're the guy who stopped? Just imagine if it was you that he stopped for, did all of this for. Imagine that conversation is going to happen. Imagine the walls that were shattered with the guy who paid attention to what grabbed his attention and asked, how can I loan who I am to where you are? And I don't think it's hard to imagine how both of these guys' worlds were changed. So imagine with me for a second how our world would look if every Jesus follower did this. Think how different our world would look if we could wrap our minds and our lifestyles around this concept. If we approached it with a mindset to serve instead of expecting others to serve me first. Imagine how different your office would be, your friendships would be, your relationships with people would look like if we adopted the mindset of, I don't need something from you before I do something for you. So I've got to ask, is there something in your path that you are tempted to walk around? Is there something in your path, in your community, in your walk that has grabbed your attention, that needs your attention? Ask yourself, how can you loan who you are to that situation? Let's bow.